All right. Just by a simple round of applause, how many of you are mindfulness researchers? Okay. How many of you are mindfulness practitioners? Okay, and how many of you attended this session because you saw the topic was about BMI obesity and thought this might help you lose 10 pounds? Okay. That was actually just my gratuitous way of getting some applause while I got to the podium. So thank you, Paulina, for kicking us off. So there was a time not long ago when being obese meant that you were healthy, wealthy, and in a position of power. You see, people would die of famine and of hunger, and so if you were obese, you were seen to be in a position to command others to bring abundant amounts of food to you or to pay them for it. Today, more people die of being obese than of hunger. And actually, obesity has increased about 300% over the last 40 years. It's projected that about 50% of Americans will be obese in the next decade. And this, now we know, is not associated with being very healthy, but associated with very significant negative health consequences and causes nearly 4 million people to die every single year. And this doesn't come without cost. Obesity costs the United States about $200 to $300 billion a year, and it's projected to increase to nearly $500 billion in the next decade or two. This is a significant societal problem. One of the populations that I decided to study was nurses, primarily because about 1/3 of nurses are currently obese, and that is significantly on the rise, matching the epidemic of the rest of the United States. Nurses are stressed, they're tired, they're exhausted, and they're in an environment full of obesogenic situations. And finally, they have the opportunity to serve as role models and educators for the rest of the population as we try to address the epidemic of obesity. So I decided to look into mindfulness as a potential mechanism to address the obesity epidemic amongst nurses. So I appreciate that my colleagues have shared with you the link between self-determination theory and mindfulness, but at the end of the day, what I was looking to do is to see, could mindfulness, dispositional mindfulness, or a natural state, innate talent of being more mindful, could inhibit the automaticity of choosing certain foods that are known to be obesogenic amongst nurses, and encourage them to make more cognitive decisions on the foods that they ate. We know that mindfulness leads to positive health consequences in various studies, and the ones that I was most interested in studying is, would it improve their dietary behaviors of cognitive restraint, emotional eating and uncontrolled eating, and optimize their body mass index. So the study looked at 2 research questions. The first one was a collective model of the 3 factors of dietary behavior and mindfulness and their predictive relationship on BMI in nurses. And then the second research question looked at each one of these factors as an individual predictive variable while controlling for the others. The study used 3 research instruments. It used the Mindfulness Attention Awareness Scale, used the 3-factor eating questionnaire. It's the 18-question version, second one which addressed the lack of meat in many diets today. And then the third one was demographics to be able to calculate BMI. A little bit about the sample. The target population was American nurses that are currently working. They needed to not be retired or searching for work or unemployed, because those are different environmental behaviors. Also looked at, they had to be adults, and it excluded students as well. Collected data from 157 after excluding for univariate, multivariate outliers, and the data was considered normal, linear, and all the good things to be sure that we're doing a sound study. Just a little bit about the sample. I won't ask you to read all of these stats, but the bottom line is that the sample did represent the population of nurses that are currently working in the United States, with 2 minor exceptions. The population, the sample was actually a little bit younger than the population of nurses currently working in the United States, and also they were a little bit more obese and overweight. The comparative data on obesity in nurses was about 2 years old, so it probably represents the continuous incline of obesity and overweight incidence in nurses in the United States. So what did we find? Found that there is a predictive collective model when you look at mindfulness and these 3 factors of dietary behavior. I asked if you're researchers because you might be interested in some of those fancy little numbers in the bottom. But if you can't read them, what we found is that there is a statistical significance when you consider these 4 predictor variables collectively on the model with significant effect size. The second research question that we looked at considered the individual variables as predictors when controlling for the others. Mindfulness was seen to be a significant predictor variable in this model when you control for the others. Uncontrolled eating was also another significant predictive variable when you control for the others. And cognitive restraint and emotional eating were not considered. Now, cognitive restraint was right on the borderline, depending on whether you use academic standards or publishing standards. A 0.06 p-value is moderately consistent with significance, but we'll leave it that it is not statistically significant. So what does this mean? How many people in the room have ever tried to lose 10 pounds? Most people. How many people know someone that's tried to lose 10 pounds? Everybody does, okay. So to be able to predict about 12% of the BMI change and variance in nurses with these 4 variables is considered to be promising. Obesity is caused by a lot of things. It's caused by the amount of exercise you do, the amount of food you eat, the type of food you eat, when you eat food, how much water you drink, how much sleep you have, how much stress you have, your biochemistry, your hormone levels, and I could go on. So to be able to predict about 12% of obesity in nurses in this population is quite significant, especially when we consider that dietary behaviors and dispositional mindfulness are influenced by training and by volitional behavior. So the second thing to look at is mindfulness as its own independent predictor variable. Now this actually was different from what was found in other populations in published research. Which is very interesting because you consider that if you think of people who are naturally mindful, they are present and attentive to the current moment, you would think that nurses who are tired, stressed, hungry, working long hours in stressful environments would internalize that in their mindfulness to say, I probably should go out and get some good healthy food. Nurses actually only practice about 5% of the behaviors that are known to improve their overall health and reduce obesity. So what happens is when nurses are stressed, they're tired, they're in a very tough work environment, and they are more mindful, the selflessness of nurses that is inherent in their personality causes them to take that mindfulness and apply it to the needs of others. So when we provide a mindfulness intervention to those who have high levels of empathy and a high level of selflessness, by the way, I see some head nods. Yeah, so people who are highly selfless and are very compassionate and empathetic to the needs of others will tend to be in a mindful moment to apply that mindfulness to the needs of others as opposed to their own inherent needs. The second factor that we found is that uncontrolled eating is also predictive of BMI, elevated BMI in nurses. Now, this is consistent with previous research in other populations. Having levels of uncontrolled eating, which is basically just eating beyond the point of hunger and satisfying biological and physiological needs, but it is associated with having a 600% higher rate of being obese. Now, this is also, looking at the potential reasons and the mechanisms behind this, nurses have very poor meal patterns. Depending on the site, nurses can have completely unpredictable meal schedules. They also have demands on their own day that they cannot control for. And if anybody's ever been a patient in a hospital or a family member of a patient in a hospital, I bet you didn't bring fresh fruit and granola to the nurses to thank them for their hard work. We tend to bring them donuts, cookies. I know as an executive of a hospital, we provided pizza, lunches to nurses, and all the hospital staff for doing a great job. So, some future research that I hope to engage in, first is to look at some qualitative studies around how nurses describe this affects their dietary behaviors, and how mindfulness may interact with the selflessness or the lack of self-care that they find in the practices in the workplace. I also think it would be really very interesting to tease out the difference between dispositional mindfulness, state mindfulness, mindful eating, mindful self-care, and how those different factors would play into BMI and their predictive relationship with obesity in nurses. We can also do some experimental studies that are longitudinal that look at the effects of interventions similar to what Paula's study did to see if that does in fact mindful eating practices, dietary behaviors, and BMI. We can reproduce the study with interventional studies of longitudinal measures of body fat. Now, one thing that is a limitation of the study is it did measure BMI. It's an easy measure. People can easily report their own weight and height. It was self-reported. But what we don't know is whether that BMI accounts for elevated lean body mass, hydration levels, bone mass, things like that. But it was a very easy way to measure this study across nurses in the United States. But it would be good to measure actual body fat. And then finally, to really tease out the data in the stratification by age, by tenure, by work type, by work site. I actually do have a lot of this data from the demographic questionnaire and plan to dive a lot deeper into seeing if there are ways that we can prescribe interventions now that we have this information based on either age or tenure, ethnicity, geography, and work site as well. The other thing I think that it's important to consider are the practical and theoretical implications of this study. It is possible that there are potential deleterious effects of mindfulness interventions. We are using mindfulness interventions to reduce stress in the workplace, to help folks cope with some of the environmental factors that help improve their performance, but it is possible that interventions on mindfulness may enhance the selflessness of nurses, which then makes their eating habits worse and drives them to eat all the cookies and donuts that we bring as a thank you. I also think that it's important to remind nurses of the importance of self-care and planning meal times, bringing healthy foods from home, working off shifts. It's very hard to get healthy food from the cafeterias and vending machines. We also need to be sure that there are ways to refrigerate healthy food, heat up healthy food from home in all the different workplaces for our American nurses. And then the last thing I think is really important is to influence the healthcare leaders to be sure that we are minimizing the obesogenic environment that these nurses are working in. We have to convey the message that bringing in donuts, cookies, pizza to hardworking healthcare staff is not helping their own health. We need to normalize bringing in fruits, vegetables, crudité platters, healthy granolas, low in sugar, and things like that to help them eat healthy when they do get that moment to break. And then the other thing too is that, didn't talk too much about this, but the dietary behaviors that were also studied here, restraint theory is an interesting one that I think merits some additional research on the relationship between dietary restraint and emotional eating, uncontrolled eating, and how it predicts obesity, especially in these types of populations. Dietary restraint is something that is counterintuitive. It's actually if you are more restrained, you actually tend to be more obese in most of the populations. And so it'll be interesting to tease that out of whether there is an ordering of those variables or it just doesn't play a factor in this population. So the study right now is in peer review and hopefully will be published very, very soon in Health Psychology. In the meantime, if you'd like a copy of the full study, I'm happy to share it with anyone. Just send me a quick email. I'm also available for any questions and happy to share the slides as well. Thank you.